how social systems of stratification and power work together to undermine Black women's health and overall well-being. But I'm not a historian, and nor am I a sociologist. My training is in a branch of psychology called behavioral neuroscience. And this field takes a more of a biological brain-based approach to understand mental health. So when I examine this topic of Black women's mental health, I'm really asking questions about what's happening inside of Black women's bodies in the context of these historical and current socio-political influences that may impact women in very unique ways. And this has been incredibly difficult to take on for a number of reasons, but I really want to highlight two particularly tricky issues that I think may possibly contribute to the underestimation and the miscalculation, perhaps, of the real mental health cost of being a Black woman. The first issue I want to talk about is called the Black-white mental health paradox. And the second one is this issue called intersectionality. And I want to take some time to explain these concepts, starting with the Black-white mental health paradox. So a sociologist at Emory University by the name of Corey Keyes wrote in a 2009 paper called The Black-White Paradox in Health, Flourishing in the Face of Social Inequality and Discrimination. He wrote, Blacks have better mental health than whites. In short, the Black-white paradox of health is the beginning of a story about the resilience of the Black population in the face of a common adversity to this population, discrimination and inequality. Although this discrimination and inequality shortens the lives and creates more physical disease and disability during that lifetime, Blacks nonetheless have better overall mental health. So this interpretation that Black people have better mental health than white people, despite experiencing more suffering and death, this is primarily based on findings from several large field studies, survey studies, showing that overall the rates of mental health disorders, such as depression, anxiety, even substance abuse, in Black people, the rates are consistently lower or equal than the rates of white people. And so this observation is often framed as a paradox because the current stress models that we use that tell us, that inform how we think about, stress in the body is that the more stressors and the more adversity you have in your life, the more at risk you should be for mental illness. So framing this model, the stress model, in the context of the many adverse events that Black people disproportionately experience, such as racism, discrimination, systematic oppression, chronic illness, exposure to trauma, exposure to environmental toxins, poverty, all of these experiences add up in the body, so to speak. And so the stress models places the brain at the center of all of this, right? And so the brain integrates all of this information about the environment, about all the things that are happening, and it shapes how our bodies respond. And this is how something so complex as racism, for example, can actually trigger changes in the body that could lead to illness, both physical illness as well as mental illness. And based on this model, which is, sort of the prevailing stress response model, that the idea it should be that Black people should actually have higher rates of mental illness, given all of these historical, and current adverse experiences. The most troubling aspect of this Black-white health paradox for me is the fact that Black people experience much higher rates of chronic illness and experience far more excess death from illness and from many other factors, for that matter, that disproportionately kill Black people. But, you know, that's really troubling. So I want to slow down for a moment and consider what that means. So when we talk about these things, we're talking about something called racial health disparities. And this is basically the observation that racial and ethnic minority groups experience higher rates of illness and death across a wide range of health conditions when compared to white counterparts. And racial health disparities in this country begin at birth. Black infants are 2 times more likely to die than white infants are. This health disparity also shortens Black lives. So Black people have a shorter life expectancy than white people. So on average, white people live about 6 years longer than Black people in this country. Also, when it comes to disease and illness, Black people are actually more likely to die from chronic illness and disease. Take diabetes, for example. Black people are twice as likely to die from diabetes than white people. Also, Black people are more likely to die from heart disease. And although Black people don't have higher incidences of cancer compared to white people, Black people are more likely to die from cancer. And this is for all kinds of cancers, some of the leading cancer types. The death rate for Black people are much higher. And these numbers represent real people. These are real lives. These are Black lives. So how do you say, you know, yeah, Black people are facing a lot of adversity, which is probably making them very sick and shortening their lives, but the data shows that they are mentally resilient people. In fact, according to the title of that paper that I discussed, Black people are flourishing in the face of social inequality and discrimination, flourishing. And so I asked the question, how does one flourish in the face of so much suffering, illness, and death? So that's the Black-white health paradox. The next issue I want to address is the issue around intersectionality. And this is an idea that comes from a woman named Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a leading legal scholar, and she specialized in race and gender issues. And she actually coined the term intersectionality, as well as critical race theory, which is a term that some of us are just learning about, even though she coined these terms back in the late 80s and the early 90s. But she first published her theory of intersectionality in this paper in 1989, entitled Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex. And this paper was in response to how the court system treated Black women in discrimination cases. So Black women were treated as either purely women or purely Black in the eyes of the law. And so the law did not account for the overlapping and in many ways interdependent forms of discrimination that Black women are subjected to based on race and gender. So in other words, Black women's exposure to discrimination, it will be different from, say, the sexism experienced by a Black woman or the racism experienced by a Black man. And this is a very important difference that needs to be considered when examining the mental health challenges of Black women as a group. So, so now that I've explained these two concepts that I think are, important, I want to revisit my approach of examining the topic of Black women's mental health from a biological brain-based perspective. So if we think about it, the Black-white health paradox tells us that Black people are mentally resilient in the face of inequality and discrimination. The theory of intersectionality tells us that Black women shoulder even more discrimination and inequality due to what some people have called the double minority status that Black women have. And so if you combine these two theories, you know, what do you have? What do you come up with? And unfortunately, this is what comes to mind: the strong Black woman, also known as the Black superwoman. There's other, you know, terms to describe the strong Black woman, and it's really a stereotype that many Black women, unfortunately, internalize, and it comes with a belief and also a cultural expectation that Black women are supernaturally resilient, highly independent. She juggles it all without complaint. She is a dependable backbone to the family, a matriarch, a pillar of her church and her community. She puts the needs of others before her own. The strong Black woman, she bears the responsibility of caregiving, oftentimes by herself, while maintaining demanding jobs and careers and marriages and a lot of things. And all of this with the added burden of racism and sexism and socioeconomic adversity. So going back to our stress model, and now if you add sexism to the picture, and then, you know, you add the internalization of this strong Black woman stereotype, and let's layer in some other hardships that Black women are disproportionately exposed to, such as, you know, multi-generational caregiving responsibilities, and when it comes to single motherhood and exposure to traumas, specific types of traumas, like Black women are more likely to be exposed to intimate partner violence. And you also have, you know, conditions like rape to contend with, just to name a few. So you can see that you're getting an even more taxed brain environment, right? With all of this, you know, coming in, which could ultimately change the Black woman's body. Which brings me to my original question: what's happening inside the Black woman's body that, you know, in the face of all of this? What's the cost, right? And to take on this question, we must confront another issue, and this is a problematic issue, is that there's very little research on the topic. And then there's also the problem of there's really no biological basis of race, nor of gender. These are identities that are socially constructed. On the other hand, though, it is widely held that sex, as opposed to gender, so gender would be the social construction of the male and female dyad, but sex is actually more biologically defined in terms of the presence or the dosage of X or Y chromosomes at birth, and also the reproductive profiles of the person and the existence of sex organs. So these are ways to examine sort of these sex influences in a way that's more biologically linked. So some of what could be happening in Black women's bodies could be in part due to differences in reproductive profiles, for example. So really for the past decade or so, a little bit over a decade, I've been studying the effects of reproductive hormones on women's mental health. And I started down this research path really after seeing some troubling statistics about mental illness in women compared to men. So I saw, I left that out, sorry. So I saw a figure similar to this where it showed that women are much more likely, far more likely to be diagnosed with an anxiety or stress-related mental illness. such as panic disorder, generalized anxiety disorder. And one particularly severe form of anxiety and stress is post-traumatic stress disorder, which sometimes develop after you're exposed to some type of trauma. And and recent studies are even showing that women have more than 2 times the rates of PTSD. In some studies, they're showing up to 3 times more diagnoses in women than men with PTSD. And the types of trauma that women experience tend to be different than men. But even when you control for all of that, the different types of trauma, women still are worse off after trauma exposure in terms of their likelihood of getting PTSD, as well as the severity of the illness. So I've been, again, spending, the past 10 years or so, really trying to understand what is different about the female brain compared to the male brain that makes her so much more vulnerable to developing fear and anxiety related, stress related mental illness, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, after experiencing hardship, adversity, and trauma. And an important clue is the observation that women have reproductive hormones that actually fluctuate pretty dramatically across their lifetime. So as you can see in this figure, there are 2, major female reproductive hormones, and I'm sure you've heard of them, estrogen, and maybe not so much so progesterone, but both of these are major female hormones that contribute to the reproductive system and the fertility and things like that. They change over the lifetime, and in fact, they dramatically decline as a woman heads towards menopause. And menopause also happens to be a time when women report really high rates of mood disturbances like anxiety and depression. Hormones also dramatically fluctuate across a woman's 28-day menstrual cycle, so the monthly cycle, right? And this is important because, anecdotally, most people know this, but there's a lot of research that show women are actually more likely to show these symptoms of anxiety and fear. This is like moving on its own. So women are more likely to show symptoms of anxiety and fear, depression during certain times of the cycle, like the end of it, or the early parts of it during premenstrual syndrome, which people have heard of. And so these are times where the hormonal levels are either low or fluctuating. Another thing to consider is that a lot of women, nearly all women, have used some form of hormonal contraceptives at some point in their lifetime. And contraceptives contain synthetic reproductive hormones like estrogen and progesterone, which may factor into women's anxiety risk. So I direct the Effective Neuroscience Lab at Kennesaw State University, where I use this laboratory model of post-traumatic stress disorder. This model was originally developed in rodents, as you can see. This is actually a picture of a rat that when I was in grad school, we actually used to work with rats and train them in fear conditioning. And so this model that I use was originated in animals and was translated. So we've translated it to study fear behaviors in humans. So I spend my time, and my students and I, we train people to actually fear things. We train them to fear certain stimuli while we track their menstrual cycles and their sex hormones in their bodies. And some key discoveries that we found are that when looking at levels of estrogen, women with low estrogen levels at the time of learning to fear something, they show more fear behaviors. So we actually quantify their fear responses. And so we see heightened fear responses in women when their estrogen levels are low. And it seems that, high estrogen seems to protect from having these, heightened fear reactivities. And that maybe is protective. Estrogen, the amount of estrogen that's in a woman's body, perhaps at the time of, when she's experiencing trauma, may serve a role in how she actually copes and recovers from the trauma. We also found that women who use hormonal contraceptives actually show even more heightened fear behavior. So contraceptive usage was associated with heightened fear responding. So our contraceptive using women show more fear than our naturally cycling women, who also show more fear than men. And so these are really interesting, but these types of questions and the majority of the research in this area is really sort of examining like sex differences and looking at women as a whole. And so you're kind of losing that intersectionality piece. And so the question remains, how does the reproductive dynamics of Black women interact with the social stressors related to sexism and racism to affect women's mental health, and how does all of this come together to affect women's bodies? And this is very, it's very difficult to address this question because there's so little research, even just looking at Black women's reproductive dynamics. But we do, so what I did is, I kind of started looking through the literature of what's out there and building sort of a story. And so I'm just going to give you a small snapshot of some of the things that we were able to find related to Black women's reproductive dynamics, just in general, in terms of like if there's any racial disparities. And so what we know is that Black girls on average enter puberty about 1 year earlier than white girls. And this is important because we also know that there is a heightened psychiatric risk that's associated with early onset of puberty. So there needs to be more research to really explore this. And this is an area that there is not a lot of research on. We also know that there's a lot of evidence that Black women have heavier menstrual bleeding, which is also associated with more mental distress and discomfort, which could also contribute to heightened risk for mental illness. There's also evidence that Black women have higher incidences of several estrogen response, type pathologies. So these are certain types of breast cancers, certain types of pathologies that are linked to estrogen receptors. And so this is very troubling because it also suggests sort of this heightened risk that Black women have with the breast cancer deaths. So understanding the influence of estrogen in Black women's bodies could help us, better understand that issue. There's also some findings overall that Black women just have elevated levels of estrogen across the lifetime. There's studies showing that Black women have higher levels of exposure to artificial estrogen through, plastics and insecticides and also hair products, which have also been linked to heightened cancer risk. And even all the way down to, menopause, there's evidence showing that Black women are more likely to experience hot flashes. And there's just a lot of, evidence there that examining the reproductive dynamics of Black women as a group, and there's room to explore that and sort of see how that links to the unique factors that women deal with when it comes to mental illness. Finally, I want to highlight probably the most disturbing truth about Black women's reproductive dynamics, and that's surrounding maternal mortality. When you track maternal deaths during pregnancy or within 42 days of pregnancy, Black women had the highest maternal death rates across all racial and ethnic groups. And especially during the pandemic in 2020 and 2021, the numbers are just really staggering. These are very terrible numbers. And it's even worse when you consider pregnancy-related deaths. So these are deaths that occur within 1 year of pregnancy. So in these cases, sometimes the woman gives birth and there's some complications and things like that. Black women have pregnancy-related mortality rates that are about 3 times higher compared to the rate of white women. And something that's really disturbing to me and very interesting is that educational attainment does not protect Black women from pregnancy-related death. So there's research that shows that college-educated Black women are actually 5 times more likely to experience pregnancy-related death than white women with the same educational attainment, and almost 2 times more likely to die than a white woman with less than a high school diploma. And sadly, according to some recent reports, more than 80% of pregnancy-related deaths are preventable. So, so when we consider the mental health cost of Black women, this is a real cost to life. This is premature death, and this is preventable in many cases, death. And these are so many factors, so many influences that, that really requires, again, a multi-disciplinary approach. I hope that we can all pay more attention to these issues and counteract the narratives that Black women are invisible in society. I've heard this often, that Black women are considered the least important and are the least protected members of the society. And when it comes to healthcare needs, Black women are also lagging behind in terms of healthcare. And how do you care for, how do you address healthcare needs when nobody sees you or hears you? And so I hope by bringing light to this issue that we can really, we can have some conversation. And I really want to open up, the floor for discussion about this. And I also want to thank the most beautiful Black woman that I know. This is my mother, who is really, I used to call her the epitome of the strong Black woman. And now I really reconsider that, now that I know more about the dangers and the harm of, sort of internalizing that idea that we Black women are, super women. But my mother it certainly felt that way with her being a single mother and doing all the things that I describe, strong Black women do. And she does it beautifully and gracefully. And I wouldn't be here today without her. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Glover. So we have some time for some questions, and so just drop them in the chat for us. And as the questions are coming in, I want to first apologize to my colleagues at the Neuroscience Institute here at Georgia State University. They co-sponsored this event, and some of my students are on the webinar. I'll embarrass them shortly, and they'll tell you that my attempts at humor sometimes fall flat. And so I cracked a few jokes about, Georgia State and Kennesaw State being rivals. So I see that Dean Monica Swan is on the webinar. So Dean Swan, please forgive me. No offense was intended. And I also want to acknowledge Lakita Burnett Bailey, one of my colleagues from the Department of Africana Studies, who really took the Freedom School and expanded it and extended it forward in important ways. And I also see Swazette Mooring, one of my colleagues at Georgia State, with whom I've worked on a number of different things. And so as the questions are coming in, I also want to say to my students, I see you, and so I challenge you to pose a question. And so while they're coming in, Dr. Glover, I wanted to ask you if there was a moment that you can identify that inspired your interest in this particular research. Is there one moment? I know you're a Spelman grad and I'm a Morehouse grad, so there are many such moments to find that kind of inspiration. But can you think of one moment?
I can. I was an undergraduate at Spelman College, and I was participating in a seminar series that we got paid to go to. And there was a neuroscientist that came to speak, and she shared some of her research looking at or showing how female rats expressed their behaviors, their defensive threat behaviors, like their fear behaviors, very differently than male rats, which was creating difficulties in conclusions about the role of different, types of drugs and different things in modulating fear and anxiety. And so fast forward, when I got into grad school, I noticed that all of the rats that we work with were males. And so again, in grad school, I started to, question, like, why do we only study male rats? And, it was, the answers that I got was all about, it's very complicated to study female rats because they have this, this reproductive cycle. It's called the estrous cycle, and you have to track it, and you have to take the ovaries out, to make it, even with male rats, you take the ovaries out. So it started very early on when I started thinking about these things.
Okay. All right. Outstanding. We have a few people checking in here. We have a question from an anonymous attendee, and she says she's taking a women's studies intersectional research methods class at Agnes Scott College. And they were talking about intersectionality and the history of intersectionality and the meaning of intersectionality. And we know who created the term, but this person poses the question, do you believe that Black women were the foundation of intersectionality? And I'm assuming she means sort of conceptually, experientially. I wonder if you had any thoughts about that.
The best I can offer to that is when Kimberly Crenshaw sort of developed this theory, she had Black women in mind. The theory was centered around the unique problems that Black women were experiencing, juggling, dual discrimination, based on their race as well as their gender. But with that in mind, it has expanded to include multiple identities. So people, not only identify across the social construct of race and gender, but there's also sexual orientation. There's also ageisms, all the isms. These all intersect in all aspects of our lives, and these all impinge on our biological makeup and how our bodies respond to the world around us.
I'm very interested in masculinity, Black masculinity in particular, the social construction of Black masculinity, representation of Black masculinity. And something that's been in the news, you share some theoretical and conceptual things, and then you also drill down with some hard and very distressing data that reflects these patterns that have been, going on for some time. And I wonder, in terms of stress, if we think about you may not have anticipated this question, Dr. Glover, but if we think about the response to Megan Thee Stallion shooting, right? And you made indirect reference to this in a way when you talked about the degree to which Black women are the least protected. And I wonder if watching that kind of response in the media, watching that kind of response in popular culture, the way in which there was very little, if any, empathy for her, right? Even to the present, with people with a petition to vacate the sentence or whatever it is. Is that something that creates the kind of stress that would register in your research, or Or I'm just interested in your thoughts about that.
Absolutely. I think the sort of, to me, too often accepted idea that, Black women are not protected, are not believed. And in the Megan Thee Stallion case, that one really got to me, when I read about it, and then I saw the interviews and I saw the pain that she went through and the mental health that she struggled with. It was heartbreaking to hear her say, she wished she had died. She wished she had actually shot and killed her, so that she didn't have to endure the pain of, it turned around where she became the person that was, attacked, and rather than being the victim. It was heartbreaking. Yeah. And I definitely believe just not only do those factors play into a woman's ability to thrive and cope, but also witnessing and being a witness to that. I mean, if I felt that as a Black woman, and every time I read a comment by a Black man in the comments, it hurt. When I saw how Black people, not just Black men, when I saw how other people were treating her, I felt like they were treating me that way too, So you do identify with these things, and they do affect you. Just the same as watching, Black people being murdered on television. It's very difficult, especially as Black women who birth Black men and Black boys, to experience this constant, barrage of young Black, lives being taken from the police. And so we have to constantly fear. I have a 14-year-old son. I don't let him walk home from school because of the neighborhood we live in. It's going through gentrification. And I fear that someone might mistake him for someone that they may think is worthy of being criminalized. And so these are things that I wear. It's a burden on me, and I think other women and other Black people in general, as we navigate the current social climate that we're in.
Okay, so we have a few questions here. I'm going to try to sort them and save a closing question for last here. You made reference to this in your presentation. Anna asks, do you think either the criteria for diagnosis or bias in those diagnosing leads to skewed rates of mental illness in particular groups due to the Black woman superhero role? And there's just so much research now about the notion that Black bodies can endure more pain in the medical environment. So I thought it might be interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so there's two things there. So I do believe that there are some biases and some problems with diagnoses. Black people are often misdiagnosed. The symptoms that are presented by Black people are oftentimes misinterpreted or interpreted as something else, when it could be a presentation of mental illness. So then you have that. But then there's the thing about this Black woman superhero stereotype and the internalization of that. One of my colleagues, Dr. Roxanne Donovan in the Department of Psychology, she did some amazing work surrounding this, where she saw an association between the internalization of a Black woman who took that, Black woman stereotype, which, when you internalize that, a Black woman sort of has this attitude of, I don't need to go to therapy, I'm strong, I can get, there's this sense of, you can take it, you can handle it. And that's what you've been cultured to believe. And so she linked that to more depressive behavior. So it's more harm to the mental health of the Black woman. So women who internalize this stereotype oftentimes express more depression and anxiety and things like that. So it seems to be harmful to mental health. It seems to not support mental health treatment behaviors, because that stereotype suggests that you don't need to go get treatment. You can take it. You're strong.
Thank you. So I think it's Adria perhaps, and I'm interested in this question as well, all of the questions, but being a underrepresented person in the academy, we know that has a particular set of stresses, maybe not at Georgia State or Kennesaw State, but at other institutions. So anyway, they ask, in the research relative to pregnancy deaths being much higher in educated Black women, they want to know, were there any particular conclusions as to why that's the case? Any link to higher stressors in academia? What are your thoughts on that?
I have to admit, I have not dived as deeply into that literature as I would have liked to be able to give that answer a real good take. But I will say, from what I do know, I do believe that there is an added stressor associated with higher educational attainment and the drive for to be successful, to be in predominantly white institutions. There are additional stressors that are, that women and that people in general, Black people, experience that all must be accounted for. And all those things, again, they add up in the body. A lot of the preventable pregnancy-related deaths are related to cardiovascular health and things like strokes and blood clots as well. Those are the types of things that tend to be risk factors that are preventable, but are showing up in very detrimental ways in Black women and across all socioeconomic statuses.
Okay. One of my undergraduate students poses a question, and actually this dovetails into Sophie's question as well, this notion of what can be done now. So Parker asks, in looking at your research as research activism, Parker is doing some very interesting research for our seminar and practical class. What would you say are the next steps as a Black community in addressing the mental health issues disproportionately causing harm to Black women? And Sophie asks, what are the immediate actionable items that healthcare providers can make? So, what are your thoughts around next steps and what can be done immediately to address some of the things that you've discovered in your research?
That's a loaded one there. There's a lot. I feel like there's a lot of things that can be done in terms of the immediate thing. That's the complicated part, because there's so much that is lacking that it won't happen immediately. So, for example, there aren't very many Black mental health practitioners. The percentage is so dismal, so that, and this is really important, because in order to get the care that in order for Black women to experience the care where they feel seen and feel that the unique combined adversities that they experience as being a Black person as well as being a woman, that it takes someone with sort of that competence, that cultural competence, to be able to fully appreciate that. And so if there are few Black practitioners that can really relate to the unique problems that Black people experience, then you have this huge gap in providers. And it's not that Black people only need to go to Black providers, but there is a lot of evidence to suggest that has been very good for treatment, success, as well as sustaining treatment for people to keep going. So there's that. There's just a lot of gaps in access to healthcare. There's issues with, poverty is a huge part of the problem, where mental health care is costly. And part of it is that there needs to be mental health parity. And there's so mental health parity is the idea that mental health should be treated just like physical health, legally and by insurance companies, so that if you are dealing with a mental illness, you should have the same insurance coverage as if you're dealing with a physical illness. And it really is the same. It's still mental illness starts in the brain and the body, just like most other illnesses. So addressing mental health parity so that people can have better access to mental health care will go a long way, so that even if you can once you find a therapist, you have to pay for the treatment, not just therapy. I mean, there's all kinds of mental health care that are available that people just don't have access to.
Right. Well, I know we have a hard stop coming up here. Let me scan the question. So I think a good way perhaps to move towards ending here is presented by Emory, who thanks you for your research. And they want to know, what's next for you? What are your next steps in terms of your research on the mental health of Black women? What are you doing next? What's coming down the road?
So that's a great question. There's a lot of great things that are happening. Most recently, the most immediate thing is next month, I will be traveling to Uganda with a really amazing research team that I have collaborated with from Wellstar College. So Dean Monica Swan, who I believe I heard you is on the call. She is the principal investigator of this really large project looking at social determinants of health in Black women and girls in Uganda. So these are women who are experiencing extreme adversity from so many different factors that similar to what we see in America. But in addition to that, you have the the rural component, the rural poverty. You have just such issues with sexual violence and other things that disproportionately affect women and girls. And so the research lab that I talked about, the translational neuroscience model that I discussed, we're actually going over there and setting up a translational neuroscience lab over in Uganda. And so it'll be a hub over there just to measure these fear behaviors in women and to be able to track some of the biological mechanisms that contribute to mental illness. And also they have this intervention program that will be sort of examining mechanisms by which this program works. So we'll look at their behaviors before they do the intervention and then after. So that's really exciting. First time doing that type of global research. And I feel, there's a lot of promise there.
Wow. Well, listen, I want to thank everyone for tuning in. I want to thank my colleagues in the Neuroscience Institute. I want to thank, of course, Auburn Avenue Research Library and that phenomenal team there, and in particular, Morris Gardner for all of his hard work in making this knowledge available beyond the campus. And we thank all of you for coming. Dr. Glover, thank you for such an important and phenomenal presentation. And I know that my colleague, Lakita Bennett-Bailey, would be upset with me if I did not mention the fact that our second Beyond the Culture conference will be held at Auburn Avenue Research Library. So if you're interested, just find us on social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. You can do a search for Beyond the Culture Conference at Auburn Avenue Research Library, and that's coming up the early part of next month, February 8th through 10. So thank you all for coming. Thank you again, Dr. Glover. Everyone have a great and safe evening. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, everybody.